The immediate aftermath of the purchase was a blur of cold panic and feverish planning. Ethan's initial rush of righteous satisfaction faded, replaced by the daunting reality of his impulsive act. The 45-foot structure, listed under the deceptively poetic name Aurora Borealis, wasn't a garden feature. It was a small building. It required specialized transportation, a heavy-duty municipal permit for temporary obstruction and construction, and a foundation strong enough to anchor it against the unlikely event of a hurricane in suburban Ohio. The first logistical hurdle came the next morning. Ethan, operating on 3 hours of sleep and 3 cups of coffee, was on a video call with a freight logistics manager named Sal, who sounded like he'd handled everything from nuclear submarines to oversized garden gnomes. "Look, Mr. Vance," Sal said, rubbing his bald head, "this unit is classified as an overdimensional load. We're talking a police escort, night transport only, and we need certified plans for the anchor slab before we even hit the road. You got blueprints for the site?" "I'm working on them now," Ethan lied smoothly, his eyes frantically scanning structural engineering websites. "It's going into a residential lot. Single-family home." Sal stopped rubbing his head. He lowered his glasses. "A residential lot. Sir, are you trying to put a working lighthouse in your backyard?" "Front yard," Ethan corrected without a flicker of hesitation. "And it's designated as an art installation with a functional low-wattage accent light. I'm applying for the permit under that classification." Sal blinked slowly, then let out a booming laugh that rattled Ethan's laptop speakers. "Kid, you got guts. I like you. Tell you what, send me the site specs. We can start the transport in 4 days. But you better have that foundation poured and cured before the Aurora gets there, or that flatbed is going to park on your street and accrue storage fees the size of your mortgage." The clock was ticking. Ethan spent the next 2 days drowning in municipal bureaucracy, fire codes, zoning laws, and load-bearing calculations. He used his last reserves of vacation time from his remote data analytics job, spending his days on the phone talking to concrete suppliers and crane operators, and his nights in his garage drawing crude, stressed-out blueprints on plywood. The need for permits meant he couldn't keep the operation a secret for long, but he needed to move so fast that any attempt by the HOA to stop him would be rendered an illegal obstruction of a permitted construction project. The first concrete sign of the coming war arrived not with a letter, but with a sound. At 7 a.m. on Friday, a massive concrete mixer truck, its steel drum roaring, lumbered down the pristine, quiet cul-de-sac of whispering pines. It parked directly in front of Ethan's house, its arrival shattering the neighborhood's accustomed silence. Ethan was already outside, wearing work boots and a determined expression, directing a crew of 3 contractors who looked utterly perplexed by the scale of the job. They were pouring the 10-foot diameter, reinforced steel and concrete slab that would serve as the Aurora Borealis's bedrock. Within 15 minutes, the air was thick with the smell of wet cement and the deep, throbbing vibration of industrial machinery. Neighbors, initially drawn out by curiosity, were now emerging with expressions ranging from fascination to open hostility. And then, Carolyn Dubois arrived. She approached the scene with the speed and intensity of a gathering storm. She was wearing her Saturday gardening attire, a pristine visor and white gloves, but her face was pale with disbelief. She had obviously intended to confront Ethan about the 4-day overdue removal of the offensive porch lights. Instead, she found his entire front yard being excavated and a concrete mausoleum being built. "Ethan Vance, what in the name of God are you doing?" Her voice was shrill, amplified by the sudden cessation of the mixer's roar as a contractor paused to give instructions. Ethan walked calmly toward her, wiping sweat and a speck of cement dust from his brow. He felt a profound sense of peace. He was acting, not reacting. "Good morning, Carolyn," he said, his tone annoyingly level. "Just putting in a foundation. You know, preemptive maintenance." "A foundation for what?" she demanded, gesturing wildly toward the massive circular pit framed by rebar. "This looks like a silo. This looks like a municipal water treatment facility." "You have violated the covenant on every conceivable level, and you are destroying the property value of 3 blocks. "I've checked the covenant, Carolyn," Ethan said, holding up a laminated copy of his building permit application. It stipulates that I may not erect any permanent structure exceeding 35 feet in height without board approval. It says nothing about a structure classified as an art installation and navigational aid if it stands at exactly 45 feet and has full municipal approval. Carolyn stared at the permit, her eyes darting over the dense legal jargon and the stamp from the county planning department. Her shock was palpable. She had assumed Ethan would fold after the second fine. She had never anticipated this level of premeditation. Navigational aid? She practically shrieked, earning stares from a growing crowd of onlookers. "Ethan, we are 50 miles from the nearest navigable water. What are you navigating? The HOA common space?" "Exactly," Ethan said, his smile genuine this time. "The covenant also requires me to maintain the safe and orderly passage of all persons on my property. My previous smaller lights were deemed aggressive and inadequate by your committee. This new installation is designed to guide me safely home and prevent any further disputes regarding illumination. It's an interpretation of the law, not a violation of it." Carolyn snatched the laminated permit out of his hand, her fingers trembling. "This is an act of war, Ethan. This is malicious, spiteful, and frankly unhinged. You will have a cease and desist order, a court injunction, and a lien on this house by the end of the day. You can't just drop a lighthouse in the middle of Whispering Pines." "I already did, Carolyn," Ethan countered, gesturing toward the foundation. "The concrete is curing as we speak. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have to brief my crane operator. The structure is set to arrive tonight." The confrontation ended abruptly, not with a victory, but with Carolyn sprinting back to her house, undoubtedly to ignite the HOA's legal artillery. Ethan knew he had maybe 12 hours before the lawyers hit. That night, under a starless sky, the second act of absurdity unfolded. The flatbed truck carrying the body of the Aurora Borealis arrived at 1 a.m. It was immense, a cylindrical white and red striped behemoth strapped securely to the trailer. Following it was the crane, a colossal metal dinosaur that dominated the streetscape. By dawn, the scene was surreal. A massive yellow crane stood ready, and the lighthouse tower, still prone on the trailer, looked utterly alien against the backdrop of colonial architecture. At 7 a.m., the work began. The crane's diesel engine roared to life, and the counterweights shifted. A team of riggers, using thick yellow straps, prepared to lift the structure. Ethan stood with his arms crossed, watching the slow, powerful ascent. The fiberglass tower, weighing several tons, rose against the morning sky, casting a long, impossibly strange shadow over the houses of Whispering Pines. It was an undeniable, permanent, and utterly absurd fact. Just as the riggers guided the base onto the still damp foundation bolts, a black SUV screeched to a halt in the middle of the street. 4 people spilled out: Carolyn, her husband Richard, a silent, nervous man, and 2 sharply dressed lawyers clutching briefcases. "Stop work," shouted the lead lawyer, a woman with hair pulled back so tightly she looked like she was perpetually bracing for impact. "We have an emergency restraining order signed by Judge Miller. Cease and desist all activity immediately." The crane operator, perched high above, simply shrugged, as if restraining orders were common sights on Tuesday mornings. Ethan stepped forward, walking slowly toward the lawyers, but his eyes were fixed on the sky. He waited until the last securing bolt was tightened, until the crane gave a final successful shudder, and the 45-foot structure was officially planted on his lawn. He then turned to the lawyers, his face calm but his eyes shining with a deep, unsettling intensity. "Too late, counselor. It's fixed to the land. I have a valid permit, and the structure is now permanent." He looked past them, toward the final section being unloaded from the flatbed, the glass-encased lantern room containing the massive, glittering Fresnel lens. "And now," Ethan said, his voice carrying over the idle drone of the machinery, "we install the light." The lawyer opened her mouth to argue, but the words died in her throat as the second-to-last piece, the heavy, intricate glass and brass lantern room, was lifted by the crane, swinging silently high over the stunned neighborhood, a jewel-like crown for Ethan's new, glorious monument to spite. The final powerful beat came 2 hours later. The installation crew completed the wiring. Ethan, ignoring the frantic shouting of the lawyers and the police siren approaching in the distance, climbed the internal ladder, and flipped the master switch. The massive Fresnel lens began its slow, deliberate rotation. It didn't just turn on. It ignited. A beam of light, pure, white, and staggeringly powerful, sliced through the mid-morning air. It completed its first rotation, sweeping over the entire street. It hit Carolyn Dubois, who was screaming into her phone, head-on. She stopped mid-sentence, clutching her temples, momentarily blinded by the sheer unho. The police cruiser, a symbol of suburban order, stopped 40 feet from the base of the Aurora Borealis. The officer, Sergeant Dale, killed the engine and stared up at the impossible structure. It wasn't even nighttime, but the massive, rotating beam of the Fresnel lens, cutting through the late-morning haze, demanded attention. It was a monument to spite, but also, indisputably, a fully permitted structure. Ethan descended the interior ladder of the tower, his muscles aching from the climb and his brain buzzing from 4 days of manic stress. The lawyers, standing near the street with Carolyn, were now joined by a pair of visibly disgruntled uniformed officers. "Mr. Vance, we're responding to multiple 911 calls," Sergeant Dale said, his voice flat with professional exhaustion. Disturbance of the peace, visual obstruction, and one call claiming an airplane was attempting to land in the cul-de-sac. "Good morning, Sergeant," Ethan replied, his face a mask of determined politeness. "I understand. This is a permitted structure, classified as an art installation with a functional, low-wattage accent light." He handed the officer a copy of the permit, already laminated. "As you can see, all inspections passed this morning. The beam you see is temporary. We are currently running a test cycle to ensure the rotational mechanism is properly calibrated." The lead lawyer for the HOA, Ms. Thorne, stepped forward, her features contorted by the afterimage of the light strike. "Officer, this is a clear and egregious public nuisance. The HOA has a court-issued temporary restraining order on construction and operation of this menace." Ethan shook his head, a subtle, confident movement. "The restraining order arrived after the final bolt was secured, Counselor. It was attached to the land and fully operational before the papers were served. That's a matter for civil court, not the local police blotter. As for the functional light, it is technically a 1,000-watt bulb, yes, but it's operating at less than 10% capacity during this test cycle." Sergeant Dale glanced between the blinding, rotating light, the shrieking lawyer, and the calm man standing next to the colossal nautical tower in the middle of Ohio. He sighed, handing the papers back to Ms. Thorne. "Ma'am, as long as he has a valid county permit and it's not actively falling over or causing an accident, this is a civil matter. Our jurisdiction ends here. You need to talk to a judge." The officers left, and with them, Carolyn's last immediate hope of a quick fix. Ethan watched her face turn from white panic to a deep, murderous scarlet. She didn't scream or argue. She simply pointed a trembling finger at the lighthouse and said, in a voice scraped raw with hatred, "You will be sorry, Ethan, I promise you. You will regret this." That evening, the Aurora Borealis provided its first full night of service. The test cycle was over. The 1,000-watt bulb was running at its true, majestic power. The light didn't just illuminate the neighborhood, it stripped away the night. Every 10 seconds, the powerful, concentrated beam swept the area. When it passed over Ethan's house, it felt like a momentary, silent explosion, turning the interior into a dazzling, overexposed photograph. When it swept over Carolyn's house, 2 streets away, it was less intense but no less disruptive, a blinding flash that sliced through her plantation shutters, illuminating her bedroom like a camera flash every 10 seconds, 360 times an hour. Ethan, watching from his darkened living room, felt a complex cocktail of triumph and immediate regret. The financial damage was already done, the $40,000 for the lighthouse, plus fees, plus the retainer for his lawyer, a sharp zoning specialist named Victor Chen. But the psychological damage was just beginning. The rotational whir of the beacon's mechanism, a low, persistent groan only noticeable inside the structure, was now the soundtrack to his life. The next day, Ethan met Victor at his office. Victor, a man who wore a bow tie and spoke in rapid-fire legal citations, was oddly delighted. "Mr. Vance, I'm not going to lie. I've handled disputes over gargoyles, paint colors, and pet llamas, but never a legitimate working lighthouse, Victor said, tapping a thick sheaf of HOA documents. It's beautiful. Legally, it's a tight, highly aggressive defense, and I salute your execution. But can we win? Ethan asked, running a hand over his tired face. We win the short game. The injunction hearing is next week. We argue that the HOA's previous actions, declaring a standard porch light aggressive and refusing mediation, constituted an actionable breach of good faith. Your installation, though extreme, is a direct, permitted remedy to the security issues they forced you to face. We frame the lighthouse as mitigation, not malice. We fight the nuisance angle. Victor leaned forward, his eyes bright. But Ethan, this isn't about the light. It's about the aesthetic and harmony clause. They will argue that the mere presence of a nautical monument disrupts the established harmony of a colonial-style subdivision. They will argue property value diminution. They will bring in 50 angry neighbors to testify. And Carolyn? Carolyn is the prosecution's star witness. She is now obsessed. She is bringing a suit separate from the HOA, a personal tort claim for intentional infliction of emotional distress, citing loss of sleep and visual impairment. Meanwhile, at the Dubois residence, the war had become purely psychological. Carolyn had transformed her bedroom into a bunker. The plantation shutters were useless. She had taped up thick industrial garbage bags over the windows, followed by sheets of heavy-duty aluminum foil to reflect the light and block any heat gain. She hadn't slept in 2 days. Every 10 seconds, the house would go from pitch black to blinding white, then back to black. The constant rhythmic cycle was destroying her equilibrium. "Richard, are you just going to sit there?" Carolyn hissed at her husband, who was attempting to read a novel in the dimly lit living room. His nerves frayed. Richard Dubois, a man whose spine had been carefully removed years ago by the HOA's procedural requirements, looked up nervously. "What do you want me to do, Carolyn?" "He got the permit." "He's in the right, technically." "It's a work of art," they said. "It's a functional weapon," she screamed, tearing a strip of foil off the window and immediately regretting it as a momentary glare hit her eyes. "It's deliberate psychological torture. I can't sleep, Richard. I'm hearing the light. When it's dark, I can feel it coming." Her desperation was turning into paranoia. She began patrolling the house after dark, convinced Ethan had installed cameras on the lighthouse to watch her misery. She made repeated frantic calls to the zoning department, demanding to know the name of the inspector who had signed off on the art installation. The temporary injunction hearing was 3 days later. The courtroom was packed with Whispering Pines residents, most supporting Carolyn, a few quiet observers who supported Ethan's rebellion, and 2 who simply thought the lighthouse was cool. Carolyn testified first, her voice cracking with manufactured exhaustion. She painted a vivid, tearful picture of her sleepless nights, the headaches, the loss of her personal sanctuary. Victor Chen's cross-examination was surgical. He didn't question her pain. He questioned her history. "Ms. Dubois, on July 14th, you issued a formal violation notice to Mr. Vance for a standard low-wattage, motion-activated porch light, correct?" "It was aggressive and unnecessary," Carolyn insisted. "Aggressive? And you refused his offer to change the color temperature and reduce the sensitivity?" "It was not sufficient. You demanded removal under threat of escalating fines because his security lights were too bright. Is that correct?" "They were a nuisance. And now, after demanding darkness, you are here demanding the removal of a light source you claim is too bright. Ms. Dubois, is there any form of light that Mr. Vance could install on his property that would meet your approval?" Carolyn hesitated, trapped. "A single dim lantern," she spat out. "So you would prefer his property remain vulnerable to vandalism?" Victor pressed. Ethan then took the stand. He was tired, but his narrative was clean and compelling. He detailed the vandalism, the failure of the HOA to protect his property, and his attempts at mediation. He presented the lighthouse as a regrettable but necessary conclusion. The judge, a weary woman named Peterson, finally delivered her ruling on the temporary injunction. The court finds Mr. Vance's actions to be excessively provocative, however, legally sound due to the county's issuance of a permit classifying the structure as an art installation and navigational aid, Judge Peterson stated. The HOA failed to prove irreparable harm before the structure was secured and operational. Therefore, the temporary restraining order is dissolved. Mr. Vance may keep the structure for now." A gasp went through the courtroom. Ethan felt a huge, crushing weight lift from his chest. Carolyn's face was frozen in disbelief. Judge Peterson wasn't finished. However, the court also acknowledges the legitimate claims of visual and, more importantly, auditory nuisance stemming from its current operation. While the light may stay, the noise from the rotation mechanism is excessive for a residential zone. She looked directly at Ethan. "Mr. Vance, you have 30 days to retrofit the Aurora Borealis with a sound dampening system to bring the operational decibel level to below 55 decibels at the property line. Or the court will order its permanent decommissioning." Ethan felt the floor tilt. Sound dampening a massive internal rotating steel mechanism? It was a near-impossible engineering challenge. It was a new, crippling cost and an immediate threat to his hay. The 30-day deadline imposed by Judge Peterson became a ticking, financial bomb for Ethan Vance. The requirement to reduce the Aurora Borealis's rotational mechanism noise to under 55 decibels at the property line was an engineering nightmare. The Fresnel lens mechanism was a relic, a heavy brass and steel gear assembly designed to operate in a remote coastal environment where noise pollution was irrelevant. Soundproofing it meant dismantling the core, lining the interior of the lantern room and the entire tower shaft with dense acoustic foam, and replacing the original drive motor with a state-of-the-art magnetic drive silent system. Ethan's lawyer, Victor Chen, arrived at the initial estimate from the only specialty engineering firm that would even touch the job, $65,000. "Ethan," Victor said grimly during a tense phone call, "you've already sunk over 40 grand into the structure itself. You've used your retirement account for the foundation. You cannot afford this." "I have to," Ethan insisted, pacing his living room, the slow, rhythmic whir-click flash of the light outside still dominating his life. "If I fail, they order the decommissioning, and I have to pay another 15 grand just to have the thing taken down. Then I still face Carolyn's emotional distress claim and a fine from the developer. This is the only way to keep the weapon." Ethan liquidated his last investment holdings, a small portfolio of tech stocks, and took out a second mortgage on his house. He hired the firm, throwing himself into the project. He spent every evening and weekend inside the claustrophobic metal tower, supervising the engineers. The sound of power tools and the smell of industrial adhesive replaced the quiet hum of his previous life. He looked gaunt, surviving on energy drinks and the white-hot adrenaline of defiance. Meanwhile, the Whispering Pines Developer and Architectural Review Board, DNARB, initiated their attack. They didn't waste time on emotional arguments. They focused on bureaucracy, using their deep pockets to peel back every layer of Ethan's rushed permitting process. Their legal team, led by a corporate shark named David Hollis, wasn't interested in the aesthetics clause anymore. They were interested in precedent and liability. They knew that if Ethan could keep the light, other homeowners might get creative with their own grievances. Their goal was total destruction of the lighthouse, not just its silencing. Hollis deployed Carolyn Dubois not as a victim, but as an operative. He armed her with a high-end, professionally calibrated decibel meter and instructed her to document the noise violation, not just at her property line, but at every single home on the cul-de-sac. One afternoon, Ethan was up in the lantern room, wrestling a heavy section of acoustic foam, when he looked down and saw Carolyn. She wasn't yelling. She was methodical. She stood on his property line, a sleek gray box held out in front of her, meticulously noting the decibel spikes every time the mechanism rotated. She looked less like a neighbor and more like a sniper. Their eyes met. The distance was 40 feet, but the emotional gulf was vast. She offered a tight, chilling smile, a silent promise of his destruction, before turning back to her data collection. Her tactics escalated beyond mere documentation. She began organizing her supporters. She initiated a high-frequency synchronized light counterattack. At exactly 9 p.m., the moment the Aurora Borealis became most visually disruptive, every light on Carolyn's street and several sympathetic neighbors would simultaneously turn on. flooding the neighborhood in competing, chaotic brilliance. This wasn't just spite. It was part of a planned legal defense to argue that all illumination in the neighborhood was now aggressive and disruptive, undermining Ethan's claim that his light was merely correcting the balance. The resulting nightly glare turned Whispering Pines into a disorienting, overlit war zone. As the soundproofing deadline loomed, Ethan's personal life crumbled. He missed crucial deadlines at work, his performance suffering drastically. The smell of concrete dust and fiberglass had permeated his clothes and his house. He was living in the shadow of his own defiance. 10 days before the court-imposed deadline, Victor Chen called with devastating news. They found it. "Ethan, the DNR found the crack in the foundation of our defense." Victor sounded defeated. "The soundproofing? Did they somehow test the new equipment?" Ethan asked, his voice strained. "Worse, they didn't go after the noise. They went after the permit's original intent," Victor explained. "The county zoning code, section 17C, requires that any navigational aid structure over 40 feet must demonstrably service a functional body of water, historical marker, or publicly mapped hazard, or provide a demonstrable public safety benefit beyond the immediate property. You got the art installation permit based on your lawyer's argument of mitigation for vandalism. But their corporate lawyers pulled a 20-year-old local planning memo." "What memo?" "It states that any private use of high power, rotating beacons, even if classified as art, is subject to an additional review for electromagnetic interference, EMI, specifically concerning the adjacent neighborhood's power grid stability. You were never asked about EMI because the initial inspector missed the addendum." Ethan felt a cold wave wash over him. And the developer just submitted an expert report showing that the unshielded, high-voltage rotation system in the original Aurora Borealis mechanism, the one you are currently trying to sound dampen, creates minor but measurable interference with nearby smart home hubs and older security systems. It's an easy technical violation of a county ordinance you never even knew existed. Victor's voice dropped to a whisper. "They don't need the noise violation anymore. They are arguing that your original permit was fraudulently obtained due to non-disclosure of required technical specifications. They're demanding the permit be revoked retroactively, meaning the structure is now an unauthorized, non-conforming imposition on the land. This wasn't a fine or a conditional fix. This was total annihilation." The following morning, the soundproofing was finally complete. Ethan, exhausted but relieved, flipped the master switch. Instead of the grinding whir, there was only a low, muted hush as the newly installed silent drive system took over. The light beams still rotated, blinding and aggressive, but the mechanism was quiet. He had met Judge Peterson's first condition, just in time. He climbed down the ladder, stepping onto his lawn at precisely 10 a.m., the 30-day deadline fulfilled. He looked up at his monument with pride, only to see a small, official, brightly colored notice taped securely to the red and white stripes of the Lighthouse base. The notice wasn't from the HOA, it was from the county planning department. Triggered by the developer's successful legal maneuvering, Ethan tore it off. The large, bold lettering at the top read, "Immediate Emergency Decommissioning Order." Below, the text cited the retroactively voided permit and the EMI violation. The final shocking line delivered the ultimate beat. The structure is scheduled for forced demolition and removal by county contractors at 0700 hours, 5 days from the date of this notice. Costs of removal, estimated at $28,000, will be placed as a lien against the property of Mr. Ethan Vance. Ethan looked from the notice to the newly silenced, still rotating light, and then down the street toward Carolyn's house. He had won the battle over the noise, and for his efforts, he was now 5 days away from utter, spectacular financial ruin and the total destruction of his defiance. The silence of the mechanism was a cruel, ironic twist. It had cost him everything, only to be deemed illegal anyway.